The Australian housing market has been totally destroyed and people need to be held liable. Many Australian lives are being royally screwed over because housing affordability has been allowed to deteriorate to catastrophic levels. Those responsible need to be held accountable for the destruction of what used to be the lucky country, where the Australian dream of owning your own home was available to everyone, no matter what your income. It's time for a class action against those who have contributed to the destruction of the Australian housing market. It's time to highlight some liable behavior, and today I'm going to be rendering some guilty verdicts. But before I do, make sure you hit like on this video, as that helps it get shared. And if you enjoy my content, why don't you subscribe to my channel? I'm independent, funny, and sexy. Okay, maybe not funny. But seriously, we need to highlight what's happened to the housing market, because if something doesn't change soon, it could ultimately lead to the collapse of society as we know it. So how did this destruction of the housing market begin? Well, it all started with the dinosaurs, especially those in Sydney. You see, they knew that a few meters of dirt in Sydney would be worth millions of dollars in the future, so they all wiped themselves out because they were trying to climb the Australian property ladder. But seriously, the destruction commenced around here when house prices started massively outperforming wages. One thing that did occur was the introduction of the capital gains tax discount. This was introduced by the Howard government in 1999 following a report by the Ralph Review, which recommended to halve capital gains tax to encourage greater investment in venture capital and to support stronger investment culture amongst Australian households. Now, in addition to that previous chart, which compared house prices to wages, this chart shows house prices versus per capita income, but it compares Australia with the average of 23 developed nations. And you can see a very similar pattern. Around here was 1999 when the capital gains tax discount was introduced, and you can see how Australian house prices compared to per capita income has grossly outperformed most other developed nations. Now, I'm not saying that's all because of the capital gains tax discount, but it's extremely suspicious how housing affordability has severely deteriorated since 1999. The trouble with capital gains tax discount is that it's really a mechanism to allow the rich to get way richer. This chart shows who's claiming the deduction based on their level of income. The entire range of incomes are broken into 10, which we call deciles. And you can see that the lower incomes are hardly claiming any capital gains tax discount, and the highest income earners are claiming over 70% of this deduction. Now, this next chart shows who's claiming the deduction based on how wealthy they are. Now, this really shows disparity, where the least wealthiest are hardly claiming anything, and the most wealthy in the country are claiming around 78% of all the deductions. And this is obvious because wealthy people are able to buy more assets, and as those assets grow, they sell them and are able to apply the capital gains tax discount to reduce the amount of capital gains tax they have to pay. So the capital gains tax discount has really encouraged greater speculation into the property market, especially because you can borrow the most to acquire a property. So it's encouraged Australians to get into more and more debt to buy property, and as a result has contributed to huge demand for property, which has caused house prices to rise faster than wages. Even the New South Wales Liberal Party understand the major issues with this policy. Their submission stated that the most significant impact was the displacement of home owner occupiers, including first home buyers, from home ownership by tax-advantaged investors, predominantly those already on higher incomes. By encouraging investors to buy and hold property, the 50% capital gains tax discount increases investor demand for housing and pushes first home buyers out of the market. Now remember, Howard initially introduced this policy on the basis it would encourage a greater level of investment, particularly in innovative high-growth companies. Now fast forward 24 years later, it's overwhelmingly being used for property and not its intended purpose. So because of that, I find the Howard Liberal government guilty of an ill thought out policy, but even worse, continuing to support it even though it became clear that it was greatly favoring the rich and pushing out many first home buyers from owning their own home. The other major deduction that has contributed to destroying the Australian housing market is negative gearing. Now, similar to capital gains tax discount, those that are wealthy and on higher incomes are claiming the vast majority of negative gearing deductions. Negative gearing allows the owner of an investment property to deduct the net cost of owning the property by any net losses made on their investment property. Where else can you borrow for an investment, make an overall loss, and get rewarded for it? That's why there's currently no other real countries that still allow negative gearing, except Australia, because high house prices are our obsession. What's more, negative gearing doesn't help increase the supply of property, with over 90% of all investor borrowing being for existing rental properties. So investors are bidding up house prices without adding much new housing supply, which you could argue is one of the main objectives of having these deductions in the first place. The Hawke-Keating Labor government tried to abolish negative gearing in 1985, with Keating describing negative gearing as an outrageous rort. He said the government cannot continue to tolerate a situation in which the general body of taxpayers effectively subsidizes the property investments of a particular group of high-income taxpayers. So Labor knew negative gearing was a rort. The Liberals know negative gearing is a rort. Everyone knows it's a rort. But guess what? There was so much backlash and so much pressure that the Hawke-Keating government reinstated negative gearing in full back in 1987, just 2 years later. So I'm not giving the Hawke-Keating government a full guilty, because they tried to do the right thing, but they really should have stuck to their guns and kept negative gearing far away from Australian property, because now we're in a right royal mess. So with both capital gains tax discount and negative gearing combined, you've basically got the entire tax system screaming at people to gear up and earn increased capital gains rather than working harder to try and earn increased wages. And instead of new investment pouring into high growth companies or even into new housing to increase the supply, the money's just flooding into existing property, creating a speculative boom, scrapping the hopes and dreams of many would-be homebuyers, whilst allowing the rich to easily get way richer. Bill Shorten's Labor Party tried to fix this great distortion in the property market. In both the 2016 and 2019 elections, Labor, who was in opposition, promised to halve the capital gains tax discount and limit negative gearing to new properties only. So very sensible policies designed to reduce the real speculative element out of the market and increase overall fairness by reducing some of that rorting. Now remember, at those stages, Australia had some of the most expensive housing in the world, so surely these reforms would have been embraced by the greater population. But that's not the case. The Turnbull-Morrison Liberal governments ran a massive fear campaign against these policy reforms and ended up winning both elections. Australians love making speculative gains on property and didn't seem to care if new home buyers could never afford a home. I know there's a lot more to that when you vote, but it's very disappointing to me that those Liberal governments couldn't support fair and logical reform, but rather chose to go down the political route just to try and win, to the detriment now of millions of Australians who have gotten screwed over by a distorted and unfair tax system that's created a shockingly expensive property market. So to the Turnbull and Morrison governments, you're guilty. Next, we've got COVID policies, which saw house prices rise 30 to 40% across all of Australia, which was the most ridiculous speculative boom ever seen. And considering Australia already had some of the most expensive housing compared to income prior to COVID, house prices have now been driven into the stratosphere to some of the most eye-boggling prices you've ever seen, with the median house price in Sydney being over 13 times the average income. Now you know why those dinosaurs were fighting over Sydney dirt? Well, the government flooded the entire market with massive stimulus, and combining that, the RBA dropped interest rates to 0. So many people built up way more savings than they've ever had. But the worst thing of all, in 2020, RBA Governor Phil Lowe forecast that there'd be no interest rate rises until 2024. And this sent the property market ballistic. But the real liable behavior from the RBA was that they repeated this forecast for 12 months. And this happened all the way up until September 2021, which you can read here. The RBA will not increase cash rate until inflation is in their target range. And the central scenario for the economy is that this condition will not be met until 2024. Now cast your minds back. In September 21, house prices had already risen probably around 30%. So it was clear to everyone, including the RBA, that there was crazy demand for property, that property prices were getting out of reach for many home buyers, yet they still forecast no interest rate rises till 2024. This was so irresponsible, I can't even believe it. And for that, Phil Lowe and the RBA are guilty. Alright, so the Albanese Labor government have watched on while COVID policies sent house prices through the roof, with Australia now being classed as the second least affordable country behind Hong Kong, China. I mean, how is that even possible? But the Albanese government's there, and surely they're going to do something to try and improve housing affordability. So what glorious reforms have we seen? Absolutely nothing.
Jack diddly squat.
In fact, what we've seen is the highest levels of immigration ever witnessed. It's not just immigration levels to try and boost them up a bit after the COVID lockdowns. It's immigration numbers on steroids. The Albanese government's opened every immigration tap at their disposal. So we've got the worst housing affordability of our lifetime, the worst rental crisis of our lifetime, and yet the Albanese Labor government is creating so much additional demand for property that the housing affordability crisis is actually getting worse and not better. And because of this, the Labor Albanese government are guilty. Now, I'm not attacking any of these people personally, but I am attacking their decision making that's led to the destruction of the Australian housing market. There needs to be accountability for decision making because the consequences of bad decisions are through the roof. Some of the real consequences are as follows. There's a growing wealth divide between the property haves and the property have-nots, where property owners are able to earn more via their properties than a hardworking Australian just earning a wage and trying to save as much as they can. You've got many Australians who can no longer afford their own home and may never be able to afford one because just saving a deposit for a home now is actually quite ridiculous. You might have to try and save for over 10 years, and by that time property prices have risen more, so it's still not enough. So that will result in more and more Australians having to rent, and with property prices rising, rents will continue to rise, which means more and more renters might be kicked out onto the streets, as there's nowhere near enough public housing for those that are vulnerable. You've got increased anxiety and mental illness because not having secure housing is one of the most stressful things to go through. You've got more and more people not even having children because housing's so expensive. So kids won't be born because of how much we've stuffed up the housing market. You've got people spending less time with their friends and families because if they don't own property, they might have to work extra hours just to maintain some decent living standards. So the opportunity for home ownership has been taken away from many hardworking Australians, which is an absolute tragedy. Just remember, a one-income family could have easily afforded their own home and paid it off in 10 years, just 30 or 40 years ago. Fast forward to today, and a two-income family who don't have assistance from parents will struggle to be able to buy their own home, and if they can afford one, their mortgage will be so high that they'll be trying to pay it off over the next 30 years or more. So there's real consequences to millions of people's lives based on these shocking housing policy failures. And no one's going to be held liable, but it's time someone steps up and takes action to improve housing affordability so future Australian generations get a fair go. I'm Biko Konstantinos.